You can use the tools of unconscious communication we are about to give you. You have to know what unconscious communication is. In short, unconscious communication is all the messages we send people without knowing explicitly we are telling them these messages. In the area of unconscious communication, there are two categories: verbal unconscious communication and nonverbal unconscious communication. Your extra senses of unconscious communication, both verbal and nonverbal, will improve as you learn the messages that people send with all these different cues. We will go deep into the kinds of nonverbal and verbal unconscious communication as we advance through the book. At first, your sense of these things will be relatively weak, unless you already have a natural talent for understanding these cues, as some people do. This means you will likely have to put a lot more thought into interpreting unconscious cues of communication when you are early on in the learning process. But the more time you spend learning the messages that are being sent, and the more time you spend accurately interpreting the subject's unconscious cues of communication, the better this sense will become. The more you will be able to understand what they are telling you unconsciously without telling you explicitly. As you might expect, this foundation of emotional manipulation comes from the linguistic part of neuro-linguistic programming. We are not only interested in identifying the meanings of the various unconscious cues that people use. In fact, as useful as this knowledge can be, it is far less important than the other purpose of learning unconscious communication. This is the purpose that makes unconscious communication one of the foundations of emotional manipulation. This purpose is to use the same cues that the subject is using. When we use the same cues of unconscious communication that the subject uses, it causes them to unconsciously incorporate us into their minds. They forget that you are two separate people. In layman's terms, they get comfortable with you. Now, they may not consciously know that they are comfortable around you. Their explicit mind might have neutral feelings about you. But in NLP, changing the unconscious mind is the most important thing for us to do, and using the same cues of unconscious communication as the subject will make them see you as part of themselves. From there, you can mind read, mind control, or manipulate them. We are getting into the territory of our sixth and second to last foundation of emotional manipulation, imitation. Therefore, we will not spend too much space here talking more about imitating unconscious cues. Besides, you will not be ready to dive into the sixth foundation until you know all the different cues we give people without even realizing it. In Chapter 5, we will cover these cues in more depth, as this third foundation of emotional manipulation is an integral developed skill if you want to succeed in NLP manipulation. In this section, we will lay out the landscape of unconscious communication and clue you in on the fundamental ideas behind it. This will make you more than prepared for reading about the most important cues and help you develop more of a mind for unconscious communication. It may cover fewer modes of communication than nonverbal unconscious communication, but if you have strong skills in verbal unconscious communication, you will pick up the rest of NLP naturally. It is common for NLP instructors to neglect this area of unconscious communication. In fact, usually only nonverbal communication is taught. The unconscious part of these cues is completely ignored, and the sheer power of words is forgotten. We will surely get to nonverbal unconscious communication in just a moment, but this book does not make the mistake of not teaching how to use words. Nonverbal cues are no more or less powerful than verbal cues. Both categories of unconscious communication are necessary to learn if you want to be a master emotional manipulator. To start out, let's look at why unconscious nonverbal communication is usually just called nonverbal communication by other NLP instructors. The reason for this is that nonverbal cues of communication are almost always unconscious, which makes the unconscious part seem unnecessary. From time to time, we use the term unconscious nonverbal communication, however, just because we don't want you to get the impression that nonverbal communication is the only kind of unconscious communication there is. Nonverbal communication is almost always unconscious because we don't think constantly about how much eye contact we make, how we present our posture, how much space we take up, how we use our voices, and so forth. People certainly do bring nonverbal communication into their conscious mind from time to time, but it is not what usually happens. Most of the time, we don't even think about any of these nonverbal cues while we use them, and this is what makes them a perfect window into the product of the subject. They are communicating what they are thinking or feeling on the inside, but they are not even aware that they are doing this. Let's go back to verbal unconscious communication though. Verbal communication intuitively seems a lot more conscious level than nonverbal communication does. We can imagine ourselves showing signs with our body language that communicate messages without even realizing it. But we don't think about the ways we unconsciously use language as much. But we all use language unconsciously much of the time. This happens the most when we are talking to people who we know very well. We don't filter ourselves as much around these people, which brings out our unconscious verbal cues a lot more. You will also hear a person's unconscious verbal language reveal itself when someone has been drinking, because they are also not filtering themselves so much when they are intoxicated. However, you don't have to be around people you are close with, and you don't have to be drunk to show your unconscious verbal language. It is harder to notice when the subject is not in either of these situations, but with enough knowledge of what verbal cues to look for, you can still identify them. The best example of unconscious verbal communication outside of these situations is filler words. In real life, no one speaks completely eloquently all the time. Depending on how self-aware you are, you will try harder to be more precise in your word choices, and you will try to use fewer filler words. However, no matter how hard we try, some of these filler words will always slip in there. On a separate note, you would do well to avoid using so many filler words when you try to use NLP on someone. When your sentences are weighed down by a bunch of uhs, likes, and you knows, it severely lessens the impact of your speech. Great speakers will allow pauses to exist without filling them in with any filler words. This makes the people who listen to them pay more attention, as well as take them more seriously. But there is much more to come in this book on using verbal communication effectively. So let's get back to the third foundation of emotional manipulation. Filler words are unconscious. When you add likes and you knows to your speech, you are not thinking consciously that you want those filler words to be in those specific places. Filler words naturally come through when we talk, making them unconscious. We can even find meaning in someone's filler words. This is your first lesson on deciphering the messages the subject sends you with their unconscious verbal communication. When they use a lot of filler words, that can either mean they're comfortable around you, or it can mean they're trying hard to leave a good impression on you. It depends on what filler words they use. If they keep saying like, that is a solid indication that they are comfortable around you. It means they are not self-conscious about what they are saying, and so they are simply talking without thinking about their words too much. The same goes for you know. This filler phrase signifies to you that the subject is comfortable speaking with you in a casual tone. This is pertinent information as an NLP practitioner because the more comfortable they are with you, the easier it is to use one of your manipulation techniques on them. The filler words and have the opposite meaning of like and you know. When the subject uses these filler words, it means they are not comfortable with you at all. They are being extremely careful about the words they are using. To bring in some neuroscience you already learned, someone using and is locked into their default mode. They are thinking about ideas and concepts. The subject is thinking about the concept of you in their mind, and they want you to think highly of them. Therefore, they are carefully selecting words from their mind to protect your idea of them. When the subject uses like and you know, it is the opposite. They are locked into their executive functioning network. They aren't thinking about how you feel about them because they aren't self-aware in that moment. Remember, your default mode is used when you are self-aware, and your executive functioning is used when you are just aware of the task and not yourself. Someone saying like and you know is focused on the task of talking to you. They are unself-consciously talking to you because they are comfortable with you. This is only your introductory lesson on unconscious verbal communication. Remember the meaning of these filler words for later, and don't forget the importance of imitation with all forms of unconscious communication. Use the same filler words as the subject uses. On an unconscious level, they will get comfortable with you, and the lines between your mind and their mind will blur. This is how you get deep into their minds and change what is in there, whether you want to mind read them, mind control their thoughts, or manipulate their behavior. Now it's time for you to start learning the ins and outs of unconscious nonverbal communication. There are multiple areas of nonverbal communication, but the main ones are the following: body language, eye contact, voice, and emotion. As we said before, body language is almost always unconscious. There are times when everyone thinks about their nonverbal communication consciously, but almost all of the time, we just give off these cues without thinking about it at all. Since you are learning how to become a master emotional manipulator, you will have to bring these ideas out of your unconscious and into your conscious mind. This is the only way you can get better at interpreting the nonverbal cues people give you. This is the only way you can imitate the nonverbal cues that the subject is giving you, so they let you deeper into their mind. Later on, we get into the specific messages that the subject sends you with all different kinds of nonverbal cues. For this section, we just want you to see how it all comes together, with verbal unconscious communication to be the third foundation of emotional manipulation. Thus, we will stick to just a few examples of nonverbal cues, what they mean, and how you respond with nonverbal cues of your own. Body language is the broadest category within nonverbal communication. The list of cues we give people with our body language is almost endless. Thankfully, people tend to use just a few cues from a relatively short list, so we will focus on those in this book. One cue you can identify right away is how much space the subject is taking up. Are their legs spread far apart? Are they leaning back in their seat in a way that seemed relaxed? Or are they sitting in a pretty formal way with their hands on their lap and their legs relatively close together? These are all questions to ask yourself when evaluating the messages someone is sending you with their body language. The more time you spend asking yourself these questions, the greater your extra sense of nonverbal language will become, so that you don't have to think about it explicitly as much. We have said that the more comfortable the subject is with you, the deeper you go into their mind, making it easier to emotionally manipulate them. That means when the subject looks relaxed around you, you might think this means you're in the clear for using one of our techniques. But unfortunately, it is not so simple. This is one of the foundations of emotional manipulation that we'll explore more deeply later on, but it needs to be briefly talked about right here. Adaptability is integral to fruitful manipulation. You can carefully plan your method before you talk with your subject and get into their mind. Your state control and sensory acuity can be perfect, and you can read their unconscious communication like a book. But if you don't adapt to the social situation, none of these things will matter. Take the example of someone using relaxed body language around you. This could mean you are deep into their mind and can use a technique on them, but it depends on the social context. Ask yourself, did the subject show relaxed body language throughout your entire interaction with them? Or did they go from one kind of body language to another, more relaxed kind? You have to understand the broader social context of your conversation with the subject in order to accurately interpret the messages they send you with their unconscious nonverbal communication. The main thing to pay attention to is the change in their body language. If they looked relaxed from the very start, this isn't an indication that you are close to them on an unconscious level. It means they felt comfortable around you from the very beginning, which can carry different meanings depending on the social context. For instance, if they are your boss at work and they stay at the same level of relaxed body language throughout your interaction, this probably doesn't mean you are deep in their unconscious. It probably means they feel secure in their position above you at work and don't feel threatened at all. It doesn't have to be a bad thing every time this is the case, but our main point for this section is that you need to interpret the nonverbal messages people send based on their social context. Reading the messages of unconscious communication in a vacuum will not do you any good. So far, we've only addressed how we interpret body language, but you will recall that imitating this body language is even more important. The key thing to remember is that with body language, just like all forms of unconscious communication, you don't always imitate what the subject does exactly. Whenever possible, you match their cues exactly. For example, you lean back in your seat just like they do. You spread your legs as far as they do. You put your hands on your lap if they are doing this. However, you don't imitate their exact cues every time. Again, it depends on the context. Let's say your boss just told you some bad news about the company. The company is projecting losses in the next quarter. After saying this, your boss is looking at you for a response. They are crossing their arms while they say this. Here, you can't simply imitate them because the subject is paying attention to you and listening to what you are going to say. This is not a good time to imitate them and cross your arms like they are. Anytime you are the focus of the interaction, you have to be extra cautious about when you imitate the subject's unconscious communication. You want them to unconsciously see that you are using the same cues they are so they get comfortable with you. But if they consciously become aware of it, they will notice explicitly, and they may even point it out. This never results in any terrible consequences for your relationship. Almost everyone will simply make a joke about it and move on. They won't get seriously freaked out about it or anything like that. However, this is still bad news for you because your nonverbal communication has moved them from the area of their unconscious attention to the area of their conscious attention. As long as this is the case, you will have to wait a while for the subject to forget about this blunder. All of this is to say, don't imitate the subject's body language when you are the center of attention. Imitate them as long as they are talking about something separate from both of you or about themselves. This is how you will get into their mind. From a wider perspective, you can look at this rule as not imitating the subject any time that specific imitation will draw too much attention to itself. Sometimes the attention will come to you for a different reason, like when your boss directly asks you a question in the previous example. But there are also times where the body language cue itself will be too strange to only enter the subject's unconscious, and it will enter their conscious attention instead. As usual, this can vary depending on the social context. This gives us a transition to the next form that nonverbal communication takes: emotion. Emotion is one you have to be especially careful with because there are many situations where expressing the exact same emotion as the subject is not the right thing to do. You can really use your common sense for this. Whenever possible, express the same emotion as the subject to fulfill the step of imitation that is necessary to infiltrate their mind and emotionally manipulate them. However, if they are grieving over the loss of a pet, you can't imitate the same level of intensity of sadness as the subject expresses. This would be a socially inappropriate thing to do that would only hinder you in your manipulation goals. As far as interpreting the messages of emotion, this is where the area of emotional intelligence comes into play. You will have plenty to learn on that subject later on. The main thing for you to focus on with interpreting emotion is letting this form of unconscious, nonverbal communication inform what the ideas the subject is conveying to you. Your extra sense of insight will be helpful in this goal. Don't make the mistake of only hearing the flat content of the subject's words. Listen for the emotion underneath those words too, because it can give them an entirely different meaning. For example, your subject might tell you they started their new job. On the surface, this can sound like a tonally neutral thing to say. But if you listen to the emotion in their voice, you might get an entirely new layer of meaning from them. They might sound ever so slightly sad, and when you read this unconscious cue, it gives you a new piece of information that goes deeper than the simple fact they have a new job. Alternatively, they can sound excited or happy about the new job, which also tells us something that the words alone do not. With that, we should focus on the next nonverbal form of communication, voice. This one is tightly connected to emotion. We can hear the subtlest of emotions from the tone of a person's voice. However, emotion is not the only meaning we can take from the subject's voice. There are a number of things you can pay attention to in a person's voice to interpret what they are saying in a new way. You might read what someone says on a transcript and then hear it on tape, and it could make you understand what they are saying completely differently. We already established how this could be the case with emotion in the human voice. But now let's talk about the breathiness of a voice. Psychological research has shown that people who lie will have breathier voices. This is because they are nervous about being caught in a lie. Being nervous makes us need more oxygen, so we breathe more. When we need to inhale and exhale more as we talk, it gives us a breathy voice. You can also pay attention to the speed of someone's voice. When people talk more slowly, it is because they are being thoughtful. They are using their default mode network rather than just being aware of their current task in the executive functioning network. As you know, people are always easier to manipulate when they are using the executive functioning network. They are not thinking deeply about things. They are living in the present moment. Because of this, they won't question it when you imitate their unconscious communication cues. By the same token, they won't think it's odd when you use your voice in a similar way to them. In fewer words, a person who is speaking quickly is probably not thinking too deeply about what you are doing, and this gives you the perfect opportunity to make your way into their unconscious through imitation. On the other hand, someone who is speaking slowly is using a more reflective neural network, so it might not be the best time to imitate their unconscious cues. Just like with every other form of nonverbal communication, you have to take the meaning of the subject's vocal cues with the social context. You have to take them with the information you have about the subject. Without taking these other factors into consideration, you won't be able to say anything about them from their voice alone. For example, you have to take personality into account. Some personalities are prone to be fast talkers. If you know that someone always talks quickly, you shouldn't take their rapid speech to mean that their unconscious is currently more vulnerable to emotional manipulation. Likewise, someone who always talks slowly may not be thinking very deeply at the moment. Besides personality, there is a social context to consider. If you happen to know the subject has something to be anxious about at the moment, they could be talking more quickly because of their anxiety. It doesn't necessarily mean they are using their executive functioning network. In fact, they could be deep in thought because of their anxiety. There is more to cover on this nonverbal category that we will get to later on. For now, we have one more form of nonverbal communication to talk about: eye contact. Eye contact cues are like vocal cues in that personality comes into play when you want to interpret them. Some people make a lot of eye contact, and some people make very little. You should know which group your subject fits into from the very beginning. That way, you can interpret any changes in their level of eye contact. What makes eye contact easier to interpret is that there is only one aspect of it to pay attention to: how much of it they are giving you. They can give you a lot of eye contact, very little, or somewhere in between. Their level of eye contact can tell you a few things about their current mental state. Once you have already taken personality into consideration, think about the extremes of eye contact. Let's say your subject usually makes a medium amount of eye contact with you, but now they are making very little eye contact with you. Our brains know intuitively that this is a sign of a liar. They are so afraid that you will catch them in their lie that they think you will find out if you look them in the eye. The subject is afraid they will give it all away in their eyes. When you are in this situation with them, think about something they recently told you. There is a very high likelihood that this was an embellishment or a lie, and this is why they are suddenly making so little eye contact. The other extreme is a lot of eye contact. Now, recall that personality is of utmost importance to consider with eye contact. Some people always make a lot of eye contact, and even if it is more than is socially comfortable, this aspect of their personality means you shouldn't interpret anything from their heavy eye contact. But next, we have to consider the subject who does not normally make heavy eye contact, and now they do. You should take this cue as meaning they are trying to dominate the situation. However, they are not as versed in the area of nonverbal communication as you already are, so they are misguided in their ideas of what will make them dominant. They think that a sheer amount of eye contact is enough to intimidate you and make you submissive to them. When you encounter a subject doing this, you should take it to mean two key things. 1, they feel threatened by you, meaning they are not comfortable around you. And 2, they aren't naturally good communicators, which we know because they made excessive eye contact. This isn't the easiest subject to have, because they will start off being on edge around you, making it harder to get into their unconscious. They are not the hardest subject to emotionally manipulate, however. You can put them at ease by demonstrating to them that you are not trying to threaten their social position, even if you are. The easiest way to do this is by showing that you are vulnerable using unconscious communication. You should have an idea of how to do this from what we've already discussed with the third foundation of emotional manipulation, but there is more to come on this question later. When it comes to imitation, eye contact is the easiest one to do well. It is a very straightforward rule to follow. If they are making a low level of eye contact with you, make a similar level of eye contact. There are NLP classes that tell you to dominate the interaction from the outset by making more eye contact. But don't do this. It will only make you come across like the subject we mentioned earlier, someone who desperately craves social dominance but tries too hard to attain it, ultimately making themselves look more submissive. Instead, match the level of eye contact of the subject, whether they are making a lot, a little, or somewhere in between. However, this is only for the stage of NLP where you are getting into their mind, so keeping track of what stage you are in is important. If you can already tell from their other unconscious cues that they are comfortable with you, you may go ahead and push a bit more in the direction of making more eye contact. It is good to unconsciously demonstrate dominance by making good eye contact, but you have to do it at the right time. You will find it helpful that we delved into some neuroscience in this section, because this is the next foundation of emotional manipulation. Let's recap the foundations of emotional manipulation we have gone over so far. You have to 1. State control, be able to control your emotions, and instead express whatever emotion will help you in your goal of mind reading, mind control, or behavior manipulation. You must also 2. Sensory acuity, learn how to let your senses guide you so you can obtain as much information about the subject as possible. And finally, this last section told you 3. Unconscious communication, how to read unconscious cues of communication, as well as imitate these cues to get deeper into the subject's unconscious. Just as important as these previous 3 foundations is the foundation of neuroscience. You must fully understand the fact that the mind is not an abstract, mystical concept, but a physical thing called the brain. This physical part of your body can be studied and understood. Even though we don't know everything about the brain, we actually know a lot. It is just that most people keep the brain a mystery because they haven't taken the time to learn about it. After reading about the fourth foundation of emotional manipulation in the next section, you will no longer be in the dark about how the human brain is structured and how it functions. Getting familiar with the basics of neuroscience does not require you to be a brilliant scientist. We will get into some details later in the book, but in the section establishing neuroscience as your fourth foundation, you will learn only the most important facts about the science of the brain and how they relate to our NLP goals.